My name is Patricia Hart, and I'm telling you this like I'd tell it to a friend over a late cup of coffee because that's the only way I know how to say it without making it sound like a dream. My parents were known all over America for their company and their perfect picture of success. People spoke about them the way they speak about tall buildings, like they were always going to stand no matter what. We lived in a tall red house with white windows in Beacon Hill, Boston, the kind of house that looks calm even when the people inside it are not. Every December, the house turned into a neat show. Pine smell in the halls, warm lights around the stair rail, and shiny ornaments placed so carefully, you could tell no one was allowed to touch them. That Christmas party was a big one, even for my parents. The entryway was filled with coats that cost more than my first car, and the air was heavy with perfume, roasted meat, and the sweet burn of expensive drinks. Their guests didn't come to feel joy. They came to be seen. I watched people smile and lean close, whispering deals and gossip like it was the same thing. In our dining room, the long table looked like a magazine cover. Bright candles, red napkins folded into perfect shapes and plates that felt too fancy for food. I remember thinking the room looked warm, but the warmth wasn't real. It was just light. My mother, Diane, moved through the party like she owned every breath in it. She wore pearls that hugged her neck tight, and she spoke in a soft voice that always sounded polite until you understood what she meant. My father, Victor, stayed near the fireplace, laughing with men who wanted his approval. He held his glass like it was a trophy. My brother Logan stood close to them, wearing a dark suit and a smile that came easy, like the whole night had been made for him. He didn't look at me much, but he didn't have to. In that house, I had learned how to disappear without leaving. Guests kept arriving, and each one brought the same energy, bright, hungry, and a little cruel. I saw Marissa Crowley glide in from Chicago with a silver dress that caught every light in the room, and she laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. I saw Caleb Winters from Denver shaking hands and talking about new buildings like he built them with his bare hands. I heard Nora Phelps from Savannah telling anyone who would listen that family is everything, while her eyes looked right past me like I was a chair. Later, I noticed Hannah Matson from Portland holding a tiny clutch and staring at the decorations like she was judging them, and Grant Hollowell from Cincinnati bragging about how he knew Victor back when. Their voices blended into one long sound like a river you can't cross. I tried to play my role. I smiled when someone spoke to me. I nodded when they talked about the company, and I kept my hands busy so nobody would notice they were shaking. Under the noise, I could feel a quiet pressure building, like the whole house was waiting for something. My parents loved big moments. They loved making announcements in front of people who would clap. They loved watching others envy them. So, when my father finally tapped his glass with a spoon, the room fell into silence faster than it should have, like everyone had rehearsed it. He stood straighter, his face glowing in the firelight, and he said, "Tonight, we make it official. Logan is the heir." He didn't say heir to what because he didn't need to. Everyone knew it meant the company, the money, and the control. The clapping started like a spark and turned into a storm. My mother opened a folder and held it up like it was a prize. "Our family fortune," she said, "is valued at $500 million." The room filled with gasps, and I saw phones come out, cameras pointed like little weapons, capturing Logan's smile as if it were history being made. My brother stepped forward and hugged my parents, and they held him like he was the best thing they'd ever built. I stood to the side near the edge of the table, watching it happen as if I were watching a play where I didn't know my lines. I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my face still. In our family, the person who showed hurt first was the person who lost. Then my mother turned toward me, and the ear shifted again. She smiled, and I swear that smile could cut clean through metal. "And you, Patricia," she said, "we have a gift, too." A staff member walked over and placed a small box into my hands. It was wrapped in gold paper with a perfect bow, but it felt wrong. It was too light, and the corners were too hard. like it wasn't meant to hold anything good. The room grew quiet, but not in a kind way. People leaned forward, waiting the way they wait for a joke. My parents watched me closely, calm as stone. Logan's eyes were bright, almost playful. I untied the ribbon slowly. I lifted the lid, and there it was. Inside the box, on a bit of cheap tissue paper, was a dead mouse, stiff and gray, its small body curled like trash someone didn't bother to hide. For one heartbeat, everything stopped. I heard the crackle of the fireplace and the tiny clink of a glass somewhere behind me. Then the room exploded. Laughter crashed into the walls, loud and wild, like I had opened a magic trick instead of a cruel message. Marissa bent over, laughing so hard her earrings shook. Caleb slapped his knee. Nora covered her mouth, but her eyes shined with the kind of joy that comes from watching someone fall. Someone even said, "Oh my God," between laughs, as if it were the best thing they'd seen all year. I looked straight at my parents. My father's face did not move. My mother's smile did not break. Logan didn't look shocked or sorry. He looked entertained, like this was part of his celebration. In that moment, something in me went cold and quiet, like a door closing. I could have yelled. I could have cried. I could have thrown the box across the room, but I didn't give them that. I set the box down gently on the table, careful enough that it wouldn't slide as if it mattered. Then I stepped back, smoothed my dress, and walked out of the dining room. The laughter followed me down the hall like footsteps, and I could feel eyes on my back all the way to the front door. Outside, the snow on the street looked clean and untouched, like the world had nothing to do with the mess inside that house. Cold air hit my lungs and made my breath come out fast. The lights from the red house glowed behind me, warm and pretty, and it made me sick because it was a lie. I waited for the door to open. I waited for my mother's voice to call my name. I waited for my father to come out and act like I mattered. I waited even for Logan, even though I already knew he wouldn't. But the door stayed shut. The party stayed loud, and that's when I understood, standing alone on that snowy sidewalk in Boston, that my family didn't just want me small. They wanted me silent. So I turned away from the red house and kept walking, leaving the laughter behind, and not one of them came after me. Not even once. I stayed in Philadelphia after I left the red house in Boston, and I chose it because it felt like a place where nobody cared who my parents were. I rented a small apartment above a bakery on a narrow street, the kind of place where the air always smelled like warm bread and sugar. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the workers arrive before sunrise, and every morning the oven door slammed like a loud reminder that life keeps moving whether your heart is broken or not. The apartment was plain, the carpet was tired, and the windows rattled in the wind. But for the first time in my life, the space belonged to me and not to my family's image. The first week, I kept expecting my phone to ring with an apology, or at least with concern. Instead, it buzzed with short messages that felt like small stones thrown at my head. "You embarrassed us. You ruined the mood. Stop being dramatic." Each time my screen lit up, my stomach tightened, but I refused to answer. The cruelest message came from my mother, Diane, and it was only 2 words: grow up. That was it. No question about where I was staying, no request to talk, no sign she felt anything at all. I stared at the text until my eyes burned, and then I set the phone down and realized I was done hoping for softness from people who didn't have it. So I did grow up, but not in the way she meant. I didn't shrink, I didn't crawl back, I didn't beg for the kind of love that came with strings and silence. I opened my laptop at the small kitchen table and looked at the truth I had been carrying for years. My parents were the public face of our company, the ones who gave speeches and took photos. But I was the one who kept the company alive. I knew where every contract was buried, which partners were loyal, which deals were shaky, and what would happen if the wrong person pulled the wrong thread. For a long time, I had done that work quietly because I thought being useful might make me valued. After the dead mouse and the laughter, I stopped confusing usefulness with love. I also stopped protecting them. That's important because people always imagine revenge as something loud, shouting, threats, dramatic scenes. Mine was quiet. Mine was a decision to stop holding up a roof that had never sheltered me. I made coffee, took steady breaths, and started organizing my thoughts like files. I wrote down the names of investors who trusted results more than charm. I listed board members who hated chaos. I reviewed emails that showed who solved problems when things went wrong. The more I looked, the clearer it became. If I stepped back even a little, my parents wouldn't know how to stand. I met Gwen Holloway in Baltimore on a rainy afternoon. She was an attorney with silver hair and calm eyes, and she spoke in clean sentences like she wasn't interested in drama. We sat in a quiet cafe, and I told her what happened at the party without adding extra emotion because the facts were already ugly enough. She listened without blinking, then leaned forward and said something that landed hard in my chest. If you've been running this company, then you already know where the bones are. Gwen wasn't telling me to destroy anyone. She was telling me I didn't have to be afraid of the truth I had earned. A few days later, I met Elliot Marsh in Minneapolis during a quick trip I took without telling anyone. Elliot was a financial advisor who wore plain ties and carried a notebook instead of a fancy tablet. He didn't flatter me. He didn't pity me. He asked questions that forced me to speak clearly. What did I want? What did I control? What did I have proof of? When I said I didn't want to do anything illegal, he nodded like he respected that and replied, "Good. You don't need illegal. You need leverage." That word sounded harsh, but it was honest. And honesty was the only thing I trusted. Now, back in Philadelphia, I began making calls. Not angry calls, careful ones. I reached out to investors in America who had always been polite to my parents, but had secretly relied on me. I didn't beg them to take my side. I showed them numbers, timelines, and plans. I reminded them of crises I had solved and deals I had saved. I kept my voice steady and my words simple because I wanted them to hear confidence, not pain. I told them one sentence again and again. If the company stays in my parents' hands, it will fall. If it comes to mine, it will grow. Some people hesitated because my parents' names still had power. But money doesn't love names forever. Money loves patterns, and I knew the pattern better than anyone. By the end of that month, I heard the first crack, and it made my hands shake. Not from fear, but from realizing how fragile my parents truly were. A partner in Seattle backed out of a major deal after asking questions my parents couldn't answer. A lender in St. Louis demanded new terms because the company suddenly felt risky. A board member in Phoenix started pushing for audits and explanations, and my parents responded with speeches instead of solutions. They still didn't call me to apologize, but they called their assistants in panic. Then those assistants, people who knew who actually did the work, started calling me quietly, asking what they should do. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what had happened. My parents had laughed while handing me a dead thing, believing I was powerless. But I was the one who had been carrying their empire on my shoulders, and now I had stepped aside. In that small apartment above a bakery in Philadelphia, with dawn bread smells and thin walls, I finally accepted a hard truth. They didn't know what was happening because they had never bothered to learn how their world stayed standing. And for the first time, I wasn't going to save them out of habit. A month after that Christmas night, I was living in a small rented house on a street in Raleigh, America. The house was plain. 2 bedrooms, a creaky porch, and a kitchen that smelled like old wood when the heat came on. On my table sat a thick folder and a plain notebook. I didn't decorate. I didn't celebrate. I planned. My parents' company was called Silveridge Holdings, and its main building rose over downtown Houston, all glass and sharp corners. The name was stamped on a metal sign outside the doors. People outside thought everything inside was strong, but I had been inside that machine for years. I knew which deals were fragile and which debts were only being managed because I kept watching them. Once I stopped covering for my parents, The problem showed up fast. A supplier demanded cash up front. A lender asked for extra proof. A longtime partner paused a contract until things felt steady. My parents responded with speeches like speeches could pay bills. So, the board called an emergency meeting in Columbus in a hotel room with beige walls and weak coffee, where nobody could hide behind fancy lights. I arrived early with my attorney, Paige Carver, and my advisor, Miles Benton. Paige sat with her hands folded, calm as stone. Miles checked his notes and shut his laptop. My parents arrived like bad weather. My father smiled too wide. My mother scanned the room like she wanted to own it. My brother came in late, acting bored. They barely looked at me, and that was fine. My father spoke first because he always did. He talked about legacy and family, words he liked because they sounded warm while hiding something sharp. He promised growth and blamed outside pressure for the cracks. I watched the board members instead of his mouth. I saw Ronan Pierce tighten his jaw. I saw two others trade a look that said, "Let facts speak now." When my father finally sat down, the chair of the board turned to me. "You asked for time," he said. My brother gave a small laugh like he expected me to break. I stood anyway, slow and careful. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I'm here to stop the bleeding." My father said, "You left." I nodded once. "I left a party," I answered. "I didn't leave the work. I've been doing it." I slid my folder across the table. Inside were shareholder statements, signed support letters, and agreements that had taken weeks to gather. Paige placed a second packet beside it, with legal notes written in plain words. Miles turned his screen so the board could see the numbers without guessing. Ronan read first, and his face changed fast. He looked up at my father and said, "This is a majority." My father blinked and whispered, "That can't be right." "It's right," I said, keeping my voice soft so every word landed. "No one did this to you. You did it. You thought you could humiliate me and still use my work." I explained how the shares were bought legally step by step. Some blocks cost $10 million. Some cost $2 million. Some came from people who didn't care about family speeches and only wanted stability. "They followed results," I said, tapping the folder, "and the results were mine." The vote came next, and it was quick. Business doesn't pause for pride. The chair read the result out loud, and the room went tight and quiet. My father stood so fast his chair scraped the carpet. My mother said my name like it tasted bitter. My brother swore under his breath. I didn't answer any of it. I signed the final papers, and the chair said, "Effective today, she will lead." Security guided my parents out, and my mother turned once in the hallway and said, "You'll regret this." I didn't reply, because regret was a chain they used on me, and I wasn't wearing it anymore. In the weeks that followed, the company stopped spinning. I replaced loud executives with steady ones. I set clear rules for spending and clear rules for respect. When I visited the Houston building, I stood outside and looked at the metal sign with my parents' chosen name. And I told a worker to take it down and put up the new name. A partner group in Europe called again, not because they loved me, but because they trusted calm hands. Then I went back to my small house in Raleigh, locked the door, and slept so deeply I woke up, surprised by my own quiet. That night, I made tea, sat on the porch, and listened to crickets. For the first time, the quiet felt like mine, not a punishment at all anymore. Years passed after I took control of the company, and the loud parts of my old life finally went quiet. I moved into a modest house outside Flagstaff in America, where tall pines lined the road, and the nights smelled like clean, cold air. The house wasn't grand, and that was the point. It had a cedar porch, a stone fireplace, and windows that filled the rooms with morning light. I planted mint and rosemary in clay pots, and I let peace be simple. At work, I rebuilt what my parents had turned into a stage. I stopped chasing applause and started chasing stability. I set simple rules that applied to everyone, including me, and I kept them even when powerful people complained. I raised pay where it had been held down for no reason except control. and I made sure problems were solved instead of hidden. A partner group in Europe came back after months of silence because they trusted predictable hands. My house became the place where I remembered I was more than a title. I cooked simple meals, kept fresh sheets on the bed, and left my phone in another room at night. A neighbor named Janelle Parker, who worked at a local library, brought me bread one weekend and joked that I looked like someone who forgot to eat. We took walks, talked about books, and learned to laugh at small things again. For a long time, I didn't think about my parents. I didn't search for their names or ask where they lived. Then the calls started light at first, like taps on a closed door. My mother, Marion, left voicemails that sounded like orders. Call me back. My father, George, tried later with a softer voice. Please just talk to us. I listened once, then stopped because I knew words without change or just noise. One rainy afternoon, a message arrived from Talia Sloan, an old family friend from Louisville who never wasted words. She wrote that my parents had run out of money, that their rich crowd had vanished, and that they were begging anyone who would answer. They're scared, she wrote, and they're still proud. Anger rose first sharp and hot because I remembered the party, the cruel gift, and the laughter. Then came a quieter thought. I could help without handing myself back. So I made a rule I could live with: help without surrender. I chose a public place in Tulsa, a small cafe with worn tables and plain mugs where nobody would treat them like royalty and nobody could trap me. I arrived early, sat by the window, and kept my hands around a warm cup. When my parents walked in, I barely recognized them. Marion's coat hung loose, and George's shoulders had rounded. My brother Connor wasn't with them. Later, I learned he had drifted away as soon as their money did. Marion spoke first, voice low. We need help, she said. George stared at the table, then looked up at me with wet eyes. We're your parents, he added like that. Titles should still open every door. I let the silence sit because I wanted them to feel it. Then I spoke plainly. I told them I would not give them the company. I told them I would not give them control over my home, my money, or my choices. I told them I would not pretend the past didn't happen. Marion swallowed hard and asked, Then what will you do? I'll keep you safe, I said, and I meant exactly that, nothing more. I answered with numbers because numbers are honest. I offered to buy them a small house in Cedar Rapids with 2 bedrooms, a porch, and a yard that needed work. I offered a monthly support payment of $4,200 for food, heat, and basic bills. I offered to cover routine medical visits and essential prescriptions. No luxury, no power. George tried to bargain, but I cut it off with one calm sentence. You will get safety, not status. They accepted because they had no other option. When the papers cleared, I visited the house once to make sure it was clean and livable. It smelled like fresh paint and new wood. Marion stood on the porch with her arms crossed, still trying to look unimpressed. George walked through the room slowly, touching a wall as if he needed proof it was real. I left them with keys, a 1-page budget, and phone numbers for clinics and repair services. Then I drove back to my own house and slept like someone who had stopped bracing for the next blow. Over the next months, the calls changed. Marion stopped ordering and started asking. One evening, she said she wanted to make the chicken soup I used to bring to the office when people worked late, and she asked me how I did it. George called another time to ask if porch steps should be sealed before winter because he wanted to do it himself. They still had sharp moments, and I still repeated my limits. But the sharpness came less often. I didn't rush to forgive them, and I didn't pretend everything was fine. I just showed up sometimes on my terms. When I visited, I stayed for an hour, not a weekend. I brought groceries, not gifts. If the talk turned cruel, I stood up and left. That was how I kept my promise to help without surrender. When people asked if it felt good to break my parents' empire, I told them the truth. It didn't feel like revenge. Felt like taking my life back. I still remembered that party, and I always would, but the memory no longer owned me. In my small house under the pines, I could make warmth without anyone's permission. And if I chose to share a little of it, I could do it without handing the matches back to the people who once tried to burn.